Mark, what's up, man?
Hey, Scott, thanks so much for having me on.
It's great to have you on, man. It's not often that I get to connect with somebody and talk about consciousness and the nature of reality and the wonder of life that also had a similar undergraduate experience that I did going to Princeton, being an athlete, trying like hell to manage it all, and subsequently take over the world afterwards. So it's a real honor and pleasure to have this conversation, man.
Yeah, likewise, Scott. I don't get to have conversations like this very often. Not too many people I went to college with are super interested in these topics, at least that I know of.
I Yes, and hopefully that's changing. I mean, I feel like once you kind of open up to a more expanded reality and start to ask questions like the meaning of life and the nature of all of this experience, there's really kind of no going back, in my experience. And a lot of people out there putting out great work like yourself are helping spur that revolution. And maybe just to kind of start the conversation off, would love to hear a little bit more about your background and when all of this started to become a part of your life.
Sure. Well, what we're going to be talking about today is about consciousness, the nature of reality, that sort of thing. And that was not something that was top of mind for me, let's say in college. Although I do remember taking an astrophysics class and then another like kind of intro physics class, and was very interested in the topics because I'm like, wow, this is fundamental stuff about what's the nature of reality. And when I was a sophomore, I was in the economics department. So I was going to major in econ. I was going to do a finance certificate. I had qualified for it because you have to apply and get certain grades. So I was on that track. And I decided to meet with the head of the astrophysics department to say, like, can I switch majors? Because that's still pretty early. And she said, look, you can do it. You're going to have to catch up. And I thought about it and I was like, I don't think I can do this because I was on the tennis team, super demanding with that. And to have to, as a grade conscious person, compete with math geniuses
Mm.
in all these classes that wasn't as familiar with. I just thought it would be too much for me and too much stress. So I decided not to major in it. But I mentioned that because there's probably something that's always been inside of me that's had these very cosmic interests, but it's been clouded. So at Princeton, I ended up majoring in psychology, focusing on behavioral economics, but was very focused on sports, being on the tennis team, grades, social life, all that stuff. I wasn't thinking about the cosmic ideas quite as much. And I didn't have a real sense of direction for what I wanted to do. If you had asked me then, I probably would have said that life is fundamentally random and meaningless. Like we can make meaning in our life, but there's nothing, there's no guiding intelligence behind the universe, nothing of a spiritual nature or a religious nature. That was not in my cosmology. So I had this, I was kind of wandering aimlessly and didn't know what I wanted to do after college. But like many of my classmates, people were applying to investment banking jobs and strategy consulting jobs. So I said, why don't I try to do that? And I ended up working at UBS in New York, starting in the summer of 2008. So I was there during the financial
Oh,
crisis.
wow. You got thrown right into the ringer. And I remember those days of everyone on campus walking around in their interview suits when the banks were there and feeling this ambient pressure to go and do that.
Oh yeah, I did that. That was fall of '07. Which by the way, the banks were already starting to pare back their hiring because the markets were getting iffy. But that was like a full-time job in fall of my senior year. I just applied to everything that I could because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And it's also really competitive. And if you didn't have an internship the summer before, it was hard to get a job. So I had to make it my full-time job. And I was going back and forth to New York, flying to California for interviews. And, actually California was later, but yeah, I was all over the place. Um, and when I started in investment banking, it was really tough for me. I had heard it was going to be tough, but there was something about actually doing it that was different from what I had heard. And part of it was being in the 2008 era. I think another part of it was being in the group at UBS that covered financial institutions. So my clients were banks and insurance companies, the very companies that were having all the big problems, asset managers. And I was at a bank that was having problems. So a percentage of my incoming analyst class was cut immediately. So it was
Oof.
tough. And a lot of my classmates at UBS were finance majors. So I knew enough I guess, to get the job, but it wasn't my instinct to just know all the lingo and to try to
Mm-hmm.
learn on the fly like that in such a high pressure situation. It was not good for my health. And in the background, I had no sense of meaning or purpose. So it becomes harder to push forward in that kind of situation when you don't really have a compass. Um, I knew I didn't want to continue in investment banking. So what I did something pretty unconventional. I had an offer to stay for a third year because the program is a 2-year program as an analyst, but for some people they give an offer to stay for a third year. And I was fortunate to get the offer, but I decided that I wanted to reject the offer so that I would be forced to find a new job. Many people take the offer and then they get a new job and just rescind it, basically just say I've got to leave. But I didn't even want to give myself the option of potentially staying because I wanted to
Know
do something.
thyself. Good on you.
I don't know, but it forced me to really become active in looking for a new job. Through actually a Princeton connection, I got connected with a spin out of the Boston Consulting Group, an organization that was focused on intellectual property strategy. So helping companies buy and sell and license patents from a business strategy perspective, but also from an M&A perspective. So there was some overlap with what I did in New York, but a little bit different. And I decided to join the firm. It was pretty new at the time, so it was more entrepreneurial, even though it was still client service focused. And I joined in 2010, and I ended up staying there for 10 years, became a partner at the firm, was very focused on that. I mean, if you had talked to me, Scott, I don't know, let's say 7 or 8 years ago, I had a very different focus because I was on that track. And what happened was in 2016, things shifted for me while I was still at this firm. And this was in Silicon Valley most of the time, although I started in the Boston office for the first year and a half. And I can actually trace it back to 2014, where my life started to hit a wall in multiple ways, where there were some deals that I worked on, spent so much time and energy on that didn't go the way that I wanted. And that was really tough for me to take those hits as someone who was just so achievement focused and not having a sense of meaning and purpose in my life. And then just like things in my personal life, dating, those weren't going the way that I wanted. So I felt super lost. And on top of it, the industry that I was in, I felt like I was hitting recession number 2 because I was in the financial recession in 2008. And then there was an intellectual property recession that most people don't know about unless you're in that industry because some of the laws changed. There were some new court cases that changed the ability for patent owners to sue for infringement, which brought down the value of patents, which affected some of the deals that I was working on. So I just felt like it was this perfect storm, felt super lost. And in 2016, I started listening to podcasts, which were somewhat new at the time. Right now, everyone listened to podcasts, but back then it was a little bit newer. Initially, like Tim Ferriss, I was listening to venture capitalists, and then some alternative health stuff. So I had heard Tim Ferriss talk about sensory deprivation flotation tanks where you float in salt water in a pod. So I said, I'm going to try that. So I went to this flotation place in San Francisco. So started doing Wim Hof breathing, just not with a real sense of purpose, but just was experimenting with stuff. And then I came across a podcast called Extreme Health Radio. And there was a woman, it was the next podcast in the queue. So it wasn't like I just sought out this episode. I had listened to a bunch of other ones. Then this one came up. Her name's Laura Powers. And she started talking about psychic abilities that she had and that she used to work in higher education and had like a political type background and seemed somewhat normal and was saying things that were totally crazy to me. And I was intrigued enough to listen to this whole episode. Then at the end of the episode, Laura said, well, I have my own podcast called Healing Powers where I talk to other people who have similar experiences. So I said, all right, why don't I just try another podcast? It wasn't like my life changed at that point, but I listened to some of the other podcasts, actually all of her episodes back to 2011, because I was so intrigued at the consistency of the reports I was hearing. People were talking about a view of reality that totally contradicted my own. These were people who were not connected to each other, and yet they had such similar cosmologies. And I'm like, wait a second, are these people all deluded in exactly the same way? Are they? I don't think they're lying. Like I was trying to make sense of it. So I started to read some of the scientific papers on this stuff, quantum physics, also a realm of this consciousness of science that I didn't know even existed. And very quickly in the fall of 2016, my whole worldview totally shifted. I felt disoriented. I didn't know who to talk to. I kept studying. So for months while I was still working, I was just researching more and more so I could get comfortable enough to have discussions with friends. And eventually, yeah, go ahead, Scott.
You know, it's just so fascinating to hear this because most people have a direct experience that's completely paradigm shattering and then go seek to find the explanation. And you were in many ways seeking to find explanation before like, some big psychedelic experience or something else that was truly paradigm shattering?
Yeah, I think you're right. Most of the people that I've talked to and studied have paradigm shifts through personal experience where it's so dramatic that there's no denying it, whether it's a near death experience, a spiritually transformative state in meditation, psychedelics, things like that. I didn't have quite that, but I had many, I would call mystical experiences where I was having lots of synchronicities,
Yep.
very strange coincidences, like totally bizarre. And I was documenting them as they were happening because I was so confused. I tried to run the numbers in my head. I'm like, this is not chance. Something's weird is happening. And then I also talked to lots of psychics and energy healers, and some of them could do things. They knew things that I could not explain. I mean, crazy
Totally.
stuff. So those were experiences to sort of validate it. But you're right. It was not experiential in the sense that I was feeling the sensations that people talk about. I didn't have that. But the evidence base that I was encountering it became so vast that if I wanted to be intellectually honest, I couldn't say that it was all fabricated. And therefore, if I wanted to be intellectually honest, I had to change my worldview. And it was hard. I mean, it's still hard. I'm still going through the paradigm shift 7-ish years later, a little under 7 years. But about a year after that initial podcast experience, and I had started to talk to certain friends about it over dinner, over brunch in San Francisco. And some people were really interested. People with my background, they're like, whoa, if what you just said is true, then I've got to rethink things. And so I was getting positive feedback from a lot of people. The next summer, 2017, I said, why don't I write a book about this? Still working at the firm, and I wasn't sure how I'd even do that. I didn't even know about writing books. I was on some big deals at the time that were time consuming. So I took the 4th of July weekend that year when my friends were out partying, and I said, I'm going to pull an investment banking week-long weekend and just work as hard as I can and finish this book. I didn't quite finish it, but I finished a lot of it. And long story short, that book came out in 2018. 2019, I produced a podcast series on the same topics about the brain and consciousness. It's called Where is My Mind? Decided to leave the firm at the end of 2019 because I wanted to devote all of my energy in this area. So that was a tough one for me because I had made it to partner, was on a really good track, but I felt so much passion for this other stuff that I couldn't split my energy. So I left the firm not knowing what would be next. I didn't have a job lined up. I wasn't going to a competitor. I just needed space. And here we are over 3 years later. I've written 4 more books since the first one. So the 5th one just came out a few months ago. And I've covered lots of topics in addition to science of consciousness, personal development, politics, economics, culture. But they're all around trying to understand who are we and why are we here? And that's what interests me most.
It's an amazing journey, man. I admire the courage. I definitely, as somebody who is currently working on a book and writes a lot, admire your prolific production of content. And I think maybe to just kind of ground the conversation, the topic of that first book, what was the most compelling evidence? And maybe it will be helpful for me to just read the subtitle of the book, which I found on Amazon, which is Consciousness Creates All Material Reality. Biological processes do not create consciousness, which is, for everyone in more layman terms, the brain. And so what was the most compelling evidence that you stumbled across that really is highlighted in the book and dominated this shift in perspective?
Well, let me preface this answer by saying I didn't start my paradigm shift by asking this question about the brain consciousness connection, even though that became the focus later. I was very intrigued by anomalous phenomena. So things that people were experiencing personally or things that had been discovered in scientific experimentation that could not be accounted for using the conventional model of the nature of reality. And what happened was I realized that all of these anomalies I was coming across, they all related to the same topic, which is how is consciousness just stuck in our skull? And when I say consciousness, I mean our sense of experiencing, our subjective inner awareness, the part of us that hears our thoughts, the part of us that has any experience. Is that consciousness something that's stuck in the brain, or is it outside the brain? And if it's outside the brain in any way, then that's crazy, number one. And that just changes the nature of reality, changes the perspective on what a human being is. So now your question on what was the most compelling evidence? In one sense, there wasn't a single piece of evidence that swayed me. It was the amount of evidence in disparate areas and the fact that I couldn't dismiss every single one. Now, so that's my first answer. My second answer is, now that I've spent a lot of time on this, I'll give two answers. One is the extent of statistical evidence for psychic phenomena in laboratories. And I've gotten to know a lot of the scientists in this area. I'm actually on the board of an organization called the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which studies these things. It was founded by Edgar Mitchell, who was an Apollo 14 astronaut. So some really smart people at this place. And they're running studies on energy healing, telepathy, mind impacting matter without physical contact. So there's some compelling evidence for this stuff, and it's at the level of 6 sigma statistics. Dr. Dean Radin has compiled these numbers. 6 sigma means the odds that it's happening due to chance alone is more than 1,000,000,000 to 1. So that means in a lab, they can show statistically people are getting information, for example, telepathically, not 100%, but beyond chance at a very high statistical rate, where in other fields of science, you'd say, well, that's a real effect. So that's number one. Number two, I would say, is the near-death experience science, which this has been around for ages. And there are scientists and doctors who have looked at the history where there are reports in across culture, across time, where people get close to the time of death. So let's say it's cardiac arrest or something very severe physiologically, and then they're resuscitated. So right now in the modern era, because we have such better resuscitation technology, there are many more of these cases, but there are some ancient cases. People come back to life and they say, I just had an elaborate experience that was realer than real life. And sometimes they have what's called an out-of-body experience, where their consciousness, even though their body is clinically dead, they're hovering outside their body and they see things or hear things from that vantage point, and they come back in their body and they tell the doctor or family members what happened. And it's accurate, meaning it's not a hallucination. And there are very smart people looking at this. Dr. Bruce Grayson at the University of Virginia, there's a division of perceptual studies at the med school there. Lots of very smart doctors who are saying, look, I used to think consciousness came from the brain, but here we have an active consciousness and an inactive brain. We think now consciousness is outside the brain.
I mean, it's something that I've experienced experientially. I haven't been in the lab results with this. And the people that have had these experiences understand that, but it's still very much not the predominant narrative in today's society. And my question for you is if we have all these smart people that understand this and that are getting very solid evidence of this, why is this not more of a well-known, well-acknowledged thing? It's like, why do we have the Andrew Hubermans of the world and the pure physicalists of the world that are so focused on viewing everything from the perspective of brain first versus consciousness first, if the evidence is pointing in a different direction?
Well, I can kind of relate to where they're coming from, because I used to be a materialist / physicalist or atheist, whatever you want to call it. I thought there was no spiritual dimension to anything. And in fact, I had thought as a society, we transcended those previously superstitious beliefs. So to return to a spiritual realm would be almost like to have a regression in our progress. So that was my mindset. And I think others are sort of there. And also there is, within neuroscience, there are strong correlations between what happens to the brain and the type of conscious experience people have. They're known as neural correlates of consciousness. And neuroscientists have done a really good job of identifying parts of the brain that directly relate to our conscious experience. The problem and the error I think they're making often is they assume that because there's a correlation between brain activity and conscious experience, that there must therefore be a causal relationship, meaning the brain must be producing that experience, when in fact it could be the reverse. And I think it is the reverse, that the brain is like a processing mechanism, an antenna receiver. And if you alter the brain, you're going to alter the way in which that receiver is picking up consciousness, but you're not altering the consciousness that's coming in. And that concept, I think, for a lot of mainstream scientists, number one, is just too paradigm shifting. Number two, I think there are egos involved, that especially people that have the reputations on this old, what I would call an old paradigm, but it's the current paradigm. And to have to admit that they were wrong, that's challenging. And the third explanation I'm not as certain of, but I'm increasingly thinking it's a possibility, which is that this notion about the nature of reality is incredibly empowering to the human. And I do think
Yes.
there's dark and light, and there's a desire, I don't know how it works, to suppress this stuff. Let me just give a few examples, because it's been mind blowing to see the suppression of very valid science. And I know some of these scientists, and they say, look, we submit a paper to the journal and they reject the paper, not because the science was bad, but because of the subject matter. I know one scientist who worked at a mainstream university and was on her way to get tenure. She does work on precognition. So this is when the body senses something before that thing is even presented. So totally crazy stuff. She was told, don't put this on your resume if you want to get tenure. One other example quickly, a scientist in Canada was told by the head of a neurological institute that he was working at. She said to him, as long as I am here, you will never study the science of spiritual phenomena.
It's crazy, right? Because your job as a scientist is to explore, right? And to explore with an open mind. And clearly that's not happening here. And it does pose the question of, is there some kind of bigger agenda? And I think this is a little bit of the topic of your most recent book, The Great Reset.
Yeah, it's getting more into what's the overlay between the general nature of reality and human society. And so that book is about what's the direction of society from a traditional perspective, but also from a metaphysical lens. And ultimately, where I come out, like I said, is I think there is dark light within the consciousness that we're a part of, this broader consciousness. There is dark light, and that's probably part of this essential part of the human experience.
One of the people that I heard you reference that was pretty fundamental for my own thinking about how to interpret that was David Hawkins. And what I love David, I've read all of his books, and what he really, I think when a lot of us recognize the potential for dark consciousness or people doing nefarious things, it's very concerning. It's like, well, why would this happen? And this doesn't make any sense. And how could some all-loving source create this? And I think what was really fundamental from my perspective, from what I learned from David, was the understanding that those people in their own subjective experience are likely doing what they believe is the right thing. And therefore, there is no absolute right or wrong. It's just different expressions of consciousness that happen to be different. And when you have that type of understanding that everyone's just in their own subjective experience with their own subjective imprinting that is informing what they believe is right and wrong, and people are all trying to take the right action, it just allows you to have a greater depth of empathy, open-heartedness, compassion towards these people that are seemingly doing terrible things. And I think, I don't know how we get there, but helping more people see that is like how we move away from this divisive, polarized society. And it's really kind of one of the most important questions we need to solve in our times, in my opinion.
Yeah, I really like the way Hawkins framed that, where he's essentially saying ignorance is the root problem, because they might be acting in a way they think is appropriate, but they have an inaccurate view of reality in some way. So to them, it's the right move, but from a more cosmic perspective, maybe it's not optimal. Another thing that Hawkins said that has stuck with me, and I'm not sure if this is in his books, it was in a video that I now can't find on YouTube, but he was talking to a monk from Asia, and was talking about the Indian sage Ramana Maharshi, who said things like, the world that we see doesn't exist. He was at this very high enlightened state of consciousness where he just saw unity. He didn't even see a real world. To him, it's all an illusion, or in the Hindu tradition, it's known as the Maya, that everything that we perceive is an illusion. And what Hawkins said is, at the level of reality at which Maharshi was perceiving, he was actually accurate. But there's another level of reality, and it's the realm of duality, where we are not one, where there's Mark and Scott, and we're actually separate. We are having separate experiences. And in that realm of duality, there actually is suffering. And because there's suffering, Hawkins called it a spiritual error to ignore the suffering of others in the world, because it does exist at their level of consciousness, even though there's a higher level at which everything is unity. So he felt that there was a duty to try to alleviate the suffering in the world and to try to contribute to society, even though at the time he was meditating like by himself for years. He decided to come back to society to make positive contributions. So I like that story because it acknowledges the unity but it also acknowledges, yeah, there's dark stuff and we have to do something about it.
Yeah, and I think that is the consciousness experience, which is there's no there until there is, right? It's like you don't have, for example, and I've heard you talk about this, like you might not have access to something like intuitive guidance or source or whatever it is until you do, right? And so your subjective reality is different, and then it changes. And with that change, your paradigm shifts. And one of the things that I've heard you talk about in your own experience is you called it your ego dissolution. And I would be interested to hear kind of how you would describe your before state and kind of how that expresses currently.
Mm-hmm. And I talk about this as a phenomenon in my second book. It's called An End to Upside Down Living, which is about the spiritual awakening process, having studied lots of people that have been through this throughout time, but also in the modern era. And I give that preface because this topic of ego dissolution is something that many people go through, where sometimes it's gradual and other times it can be a moment where their sense of being an individual self and having only self-focused needs and be identifying as the individual, that seems to go away. And I've had maybe a few minor experiences in meditation where I felt something that was very different than my normal experience. But there are other people where, whether it's Hawkins has written about his experience. Adyashanti, the spiritual teacher, has a famous one, but there are lots of people, these experiences where they don't feel like they are an individual self anymore. They feel like they are the oneness. They are the consciousness beyond the body that is having an experience through the body. I mean, Hawkins often talked about he would see his arm move and he would say, "It's the arm that moves." He didn't even identify.
Yeah, when he writes his books, he's like the author. I'm like, dude, you're talking about yourself in third person.
Because that's the way some people start to see it, is that they are observing the body as this entity that is being operated by consciousness. So it's a shift in perspective. My own ego dissolution, quote unquote, is it's not a full dissolution of like forgetting that I'm Mark the person, but it's the attachment to that character is less and less. And I don't notice it on a day-to-day basis, but when I think about things or have memories of just like certain events over the past 7-ish years, or even where I was before that, I look at myself in a very different way. My priorities are totally shifted in terms of looking at, well, what's the purpose of Mark being here? It's much less focused on my individual accomplishments, even though that's still definitely there. The purpose of those accomplishments, the purpose of the goals that I have now, it's oriented in a different direction. So the things that I used to care about a lot or get upset about, they just don't affect me in the same way. I think that's a big symptom of this dissolution, because I might have only been affected by something in that way in the past because I was so attached to the character Mark and the reputation of the character Mark. And I had this limited perspective. So when the perspective is broadened and you're looking at it from a 30,000 point view, and you've got you have like the Hawkins perspective, where it's the entity known as Mark is doing this rather than I am doing this. It starts to move in that direction a bit more, and there's a calmness and it's not passivity, because I think there's still a desire to be active, but there's much more of a calmness all the time.
Yeah, that's beautiful, man. I can say my experience is similar where, and I think meditation plays a part in this, where there is that separation from the thoughts and actions and to the observer of that. And in that, you realize that so many of those compulsive reactions that were associated with, old Mark or old Scott they're just programs, man. It's just like software programs that you downloaded that, probably need to be cleaned out, and that's okay. And, there's just, I think a lot of people think like the ego goes away, and it's like, no, it's kind of more like quiets down at first. Right. And you're increasingly existing in harmony, with this kind of higher awareness that sees the ego probably increasingly more and more, versus just getting sucked into that experience. And that does take on a more peaceful texture.
Yeah. I mean, The ego is not, depending on the teachings you listen to, some people will really try to demean the ego like it's this thing that we have to get rid of. I view it more as the personality that we are currently inhabiting. And the more we get our attachment to that personality out of the way, the more it can be its unique self to do what it has to do in the world. So there's value in being that unique self as a quote unquote ego. But I think it's the attachment to it that's the key aspect of the dissolution.
Yeah, that's totally. And one of the things that I really liked that I heard you talk about in your writing is this notion of kind of declaring, I'm a vessel for the greatest good. The benevolent force, can basically do this act through me. And that to me is like kind of like a textbook expression of the recognition of kind of this higher divinity and this contention between the kind of personal will and like the will of this greater force that you don't know where it's going to take you, and is beyond these kind of conditioned preferences. And I think it would be awesome to hear kind of how that shows up in your life today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is another huge shift relative to how I used to do everything, because I thought I was the one fully in control and there was no intelligence outside of me because I had a materialist, physicalist worldview. So when it flipped and I said, wait a second, I'm not a body having a conscious experience. I am consciousness that is experiencing life through the vessel known as Mark, but I'm also part of this bigger consciousness. Whoa, everything starts to shift. And I do think, I guess my current hypothesis is that it's at the highest level of reality, even though there is dark light, the highest level of reality is benevolent. And it is much more intelligent than any individual. So it's like, I'm not in control fully, but maybe I do have the control to set my intention to try to tap into that intelligence, to channel it, to embody it. So throughout my process over the last few years, it's something that I've consciously done, is to try to orient my mind in that direction, to try to bring that in. And even when I write books, like before I sit down, I set that intention. And there are other intelligences, invisible ones, and I've written about this, and I know lots of people who have direct experience with it.
Yeah.
But we're not alone, and it's not all physical. So it's multidimensional stuff. And I do think there are beings who can be helpful. There can be beings who are tricksters too. So that's an important qualification, that there is discernment needed in this process for sure. But what I try to do is to set the intention to get help from the benevolent ones to in my work, have the best impact possible on everyone. So that's basically the intention I set when I do stuff. I try to keep it really broad rather than saying, I want this book to sell X number of copies. I want this house. That's not what I'm doing. I'm trying to do these very broad, let me be of service. And usually when that happens is that I end up in a situation where my passions are aligned with what I'm doing, which is what I want anyway.
Yeah. There's room to fully express. There's room for your highest expression to fully express, because there isn't such conditionality.
Yeah.
And it's one of the other things that Hawkins said that really stuck out to me, is that like intention is like the strongest, it's like the most powerful sword on the spiritual path, is once you align your intention to your expansion of consciousness, like reality will unfold in a way to basically serve that, as well as other intentions like the one that you talk of, which is really, really beautiful, man. And one of the things that, very similar, I had a very similar experience for me, where it's entirely logic driven, very data driven. And now it's, much more kind of about spontaneity and following the energy and the aliveness and the guidance that comes through in the stillness. And with writing, that just looks like, honestly, like things just coming out of you, not even thinking. How have you been able to make that shift? Because it is a shift that's very hard for a lot of people, to move away from, such rigid planning, thinking, controlling, to one that's more open, spontaneous, trusting.
I think the evidence simply led me there. And I said to myself, I can't deny all of these things that I've learned. And if I want to just be honest with myself, then I'm going to have to change my perspective. I don't have a choice. It would just be stupid to do it the way that I used to, even though I'm biologically wired still, and I still have conditioning that I have to pull out of. So it was a conscious decision to just reorient everything. And this notion of intention that Hawkins talks about, and you just mentioned, I think it's critical. I start my second book and end Upside Down Living. I ask the question of the reader, what is the overall intention of your life? And the book seeks to answer that question. And I kind of give my own journey, but also how other people have thought about it, because I don't think I had thought about that question. That's the ultimate question for all of us, really, is where's our compass pointed? And to really have a clear perspective on what our overall intention is critical. But once you have it, then everything is guided by that, each decision. So then, I guess this goes to your question too, of like, how do you make that shift? Understanding that you move in that direction, not through your own individual will, that there's other stuff going on. And that's a shift. I don't know how to advise on how to get there, other than it's your own journey of exploration. And maybe it's through a direct experience that you have, or maybe it's through reading Hawkins and other people. But it's the inner journey to get you to that point.
It is. And what I think that, you talk about evidence. I actually think that is a really important part of it. Is like, when I think about developing unconditional trust for reality, the universe, these kind of more vast intelligences, part of that is like, it's like a dating process, right? Where it's like, you go on a date and you're like, okay, that went well. And then I'm going to like do a more aggressive date, and more aggressive until you eventually find yourself in this kind of loving relationship, where there's lots of trust and you know that you're cared for. And, that's kind of how it works. It takes time. And so for me, one of the things that I did was, as I started to kind of follow and tune into intuition versus the logic mind, is I would write down all my piece of guidance I would get, and I would pose guidance in the stillness, and I would follow it, and I would track it, and I would look at how things turned out. And what was undeniable to me is that shit was going really well. And it was like, it almost felt like it was foolish for me to not check in with source, because the results that I had gotten in my life were so amazing. And that's why I think like there is room for that kind of data-driven evidence person to still play with this stuff and actually use that as a mechanism to end up in a place that is perhaps less rigid, more open, more trusting.
Mm-hmm. It's a trial and error process. I can totally relate to what you're talking about. And then you start to tap in to what is the real guidance versus what is your mind getting in the way. It's like, if your brain is an antenna, if we want to use that analogy, it's picking up a pure signal and not noise. And there's an art and a science to that in different ways. So it takes time. I think I'm still trying to resolve it in myself. There's also an inner feeling that's associated with the right move that I can now start to identify, that I could not explain to you with words. And this is the trial and error of like going on that inner journey. But
it's all like a texture. It's all a texture thing. It's just the texture of the thing, that the thought in your awareness, the texture of your body. It really is a feel experiential thing versus something that you can, at least in current form, just download and now you know the difference. It takes time.
Right. It's not an algorithm. This is something beyond that we're tapping into, but being discerning in this process is really critical. There are two stories that come to mind that I talk about in the Upside Down Living book, but they both shifted my perspective when I learned them. So one was a woman who had this amazing awakening experience, and she was on a podcast called Buddha at the Gas Pump, which the host, Rick Archer, goes through, interviews people who had modern awakening experiences. And he shows, look, there's a lot of awakenings happening. In any event, this woman had a major awakening, was experiencing love toward everyone, and that was her guidance, love toward everything. Then she met a guy and let the guy into her home. And she said the guy was manipulative and made her life hell. She said, I couldn't discern. So she was in this state where she was blindly led by benevolence and love, and just was not discriminating as appropriate. So that's an important part of this, is to acknowledge that the discrimination is actually important. To acknowledge it's not always just love and light, that you've got to look at both. And the other one was a woman who was engaging in channeling. And channeling is the process of tapping into an external entity. And there's been science on this. Helene Wabe at the Institute of Noetic Sciences has looked at this. It's not in every case a multiple personality disorder like many people think. There's something unique happening, and there's a book called The Science of Channeling on this. In any event, this woman was tapping into spirits that were guiding her, and like entities that were not physical, and they were giving her good advice. And she took the advice for a while, and then they said, "Look, you should quit your job." She goes, "I don't know if this is a good decision." And she ended up leaving her job, and it ended up being a horrible decision. And she heard these entities then laughing, saying, "You should kill yourself." Okay.
Wow.
So what happened was these were demonic beings, which I think are very real. My point is there is the antenna has to be finely tuned in this guidance process.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. And I definitely have experienced beings and channeling that was nefarious in nature. And the thing with a thing that I think with all this stuff is like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, it's just like humans, right? Like you're going to get a lot of good stuff. And then, maybe there's some bad ones. And that doesn't mean that you completely abandon intuition or, trying to get guidance with a still mind and all that kind of stuff. One other thing that I wanted to get your opinion on is, this notion of there is some higher intelligence that's orchestrating all of this and that we are a part of it. I think that one of the ways, like the gateway to unity consciousness and seeing that is the synchronicity, is the experience of things being so perfectly choreographed that there's no way that there isn't some type of interconnectedness between all of us and guidance that's happened. And I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm with you now. 7+ years ago, I wouldn't have been. I would have said, well, it's not perfectly orchestrated. This is what happens in a big universe. Chance says that we're going to end up with this configuration. To me, that is now the long shot. That's the Hail Mary. I think that is a leap of faith to assume it, given the complexity in the universe. And if you look at like some of the constants in the universe that scientists have said, we live in a Goldilocks universe where the constants are so finely tuned to allow things to exist the way they do. There are lots of examples like that suggest that there is a perfection that could be more parsimoniously explained as there's a higher intelligence involved. And even when I look at my own life and I've seen things have happened, even things that were seemingly negative, I've been totally steered. Everything that I look back on in hindsight, I can see it's like it's too perfect. I couldn't have done that. A supercomputer couldn't have done that either. We're talking about some kind of transcendent consciousness to be able to have a world like this where each individual biological being is having this sort of crazy experience. I do think it's orchestrated.
And I think one thing that helps people see that is when you start to recontextualize your life events for something like the evolution of consciousness. When life is contextualized as all of your preferences being met, and then it's pretty hard to see things and be like, oh, this is all perfect, right? But when you start to look at life in that way, you start to see the meaning in all of it, and that I think inspires that sense of awe and awareness to, oh my gosh, like, yes, I am perfectly positioned for this journey that I'm going on in my own evolution.
And I think that mentality helps one cope with challenges much better. I've noticed that in my own life when a challenge comes up, I'm like, okay, what's going on here? What should I be learning from this? What am I resisting maybe? And I can't always come up with an answer, but at least I think it takes some of the pain and suffering away from the situation.
Absolutely. And you know what? I can literally hear a friend of mine right now who is a, kind of very scientific oriented physicalist who would say that and is like, okay, well, that's the story that you tell yourself to feel good, is that you kind of contextualize everything for your growth. And like, even if it is, who doesn't want more meaning in every situation? Like, who doesn't want to feel good? Like, who gives a shit? If it is actually fundamental truth or not, like, one to me does create a better experience. And so I don't know. That's how I look at it. Even if I don't have all of the answers, and that's good enough for me.
Yeah. And I think also looking back in hindsight, you can actually gather some data to see where you had challenge X and it led to something unpredictable in the future that you couldn't have calculated. And again, your friend would probably say, well, yeah, that's bound to happen sometimes. I mean, a lot of this stuff is unprovable. And back to our earlier point, there is an experiential element to this. And this is why consciousness is so important. Consciousness is not physical. It is experiential. I can't touch consciousness. And that's the fundamental aspect to this. So it is the individual journey for each person to have these recognitions.
Completely agree. And speaking of individual journeys, Mark, you've written 5 books in what, 3 years, 3-ish years, something like that.
Yeah, a little more. Right, 2018, the first book came out. So yeah.
And so you've had this prolific run. Like, what's alive for you now? Keep writing. What does the next phase of your journey look like?
Well, going back to what you said about trust, I'm in the phase that I've been in multiple times now, where I left my job and a book comes out, and then I'm not sure what I'm going to do. Usually a new passion emerges, but I'm in that state again where I really am not sure. I don't know even where I'm going to live next, or to have a more permanent location, because I've been kind of nomadic. So I continue to be very interested in all these big questions about the metaphysical nature of reality, but also the nature of our society and what's actually happening and what the interplay is. So I am studying a lot, and I am speaking on podcasts and things like that, but I don't have a specific project.
Nice, man. Well, you're exactly where you're supposed to be, and it will emerge when it's supposed to, whatever's next. Well, dude, this has been awesome. Huge fan of everything that you're creating in the world. I think people hopefully got a small taste of that today. I highly recommend reading all of Mark's books, checking him out on other podcasts. I listened to the Kyle Kingsbury one. I thought that was awesome. Where should people go to follow your work?
Well, Scott, first, I want to thank you for having me, and thank you for the work that you're doing. I really appreciate the voice that you're bringing to this. And I think you're already having a big impact, but are going to have a really big impact.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, I really do. You're doing a great job at it. My website is one place to find me. It's markgober.com, markgober.com. And my 5 books are all on Amazon. You can get them in hard copy, Kindle, or Audible. And my podcast series is called Where Is My Mind? And that's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the other major players.
And all those will be linked to in the show notes. Well, Mark, tremendous conversation, man. You're the man. Love everything you're doing, and keep it up. And we're very grateful for everyone that's took the time to listen to this today. It's really, really a pleasure to serve you guys in this way. Well, thanks so much, everyone. And thanks, Mark.
Thanks again, Scott.